Good afternoon. It's Sunday the 4th of July, and this is The Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Andrew Wilson, and today, for the first time, I'm lucky enough to be presenting the programme from our studios in Glasgow. We're joined by two extremely interesting and informed guests this afternoon. First of all, we're joined by Erin Lux. Erin is a PhD student at the University of Strathclyde, and she's also the treasurer of Out for Independence. Erin, good afternoon. How are you today?
Good afternoon. Great. Happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And we're also joined from Inverness by Emma Roddick. Emma is the MSP, as a list MSP for the Highlands and Islands. Emma, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Yeah, good. Looking forward to chatting about politics. Don't get to do much of that.
Well, we're extremely lucky to have you both and to have you, Emma. Thank you both for joining us. And as you say, coming along to discuss politics and the news over the past 7 days in a slightly more reflective manner, because we have an hour to do it on a Sunday lunchtime. What we'll do first is I'll quickly provide you with the daily COVID update, and then, as I say, we'll begin to review the top stories from the news over the past 7 days. For the coronavirus update, as at 2 p.m. on Saturday the 3rd of July, there were 3,108 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There were 3 new reported deaths, sadly, of people who had tested positive. 3,844,371 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,749,373 have received their second dose. 306 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 25 of whom were now in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 292,387 people have tested positive for the COVID-19 coronavirus, and in total 7,729 patients who had tested positive have sadly died. Now, having made the coronavirus update for you, we'll talk about the ongoing pandemic, first of all, with our two guests. The situation continues to evolve, as you would expect. Our understanding of the virus and our understanding of the epidemiology that goes with it, and also our understanding of the public health implications, of course, continues to evolve and to develop. And so that, combined with the change, with the inevitable change in circumstances, the schools are closing now, and so the way in which people are mixing has changed and will continue to change. And at the same time, we're seeing a rise in the number of infections. Weekly cases, I think, in Scotland are now at about 375 per 100,000 people, which is the highest that the rate of infection has ever been. I think the peak in April last year was about 302. So we're seeing changes in evolution in the pandemic. For example, with our better understanding now of the Delta variant and the way in which it was seeded into Scotland, we think through Glasgow, and also the understanding of the impact of the way in which our daily lives are changing. So I'll come to you first, Emma. What's your takeaway from the events this week, and what's your view at the moment of the way in which the pandemic and our response to the pandemic is evolving and changing in Scotland?
Well, I think it's always going to be really frightening for folk to see the rising case numbers, but what we have to remember is that there are fewer people getting seriously ill and fewer people dying, and that is what is important. It's clear that the vaccination programme is helping us there, and we absolutely have to stick with it. I think what matters is not really where you caught it or why you caught it, but the fact that if you're breaking rules and not being aware of the fact that you have it, you're not getting tested and you're spreading it to others, then that's what you need to be aware of, and that's what is wrong in these circumstances.
That's a good point. Certainly, it struck me that the widespread rollout and widespread availability of the lateral flow tests and the beginning of the campaigns to encourage everybody to test twice a week or more. Do you think that's, from your perspective or from your your conversations with constituents, is that something that you think, Emma, is beginning to have some sort of traction in the population?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it depends where you are, but certainly when I've gone to the islands, I test myself 3 days beforehand and then the day of travel, and it seems to be very commonplace in Orkney and Shetland in particular. I think we need to maybe do a bit more to encourage people on the mainland to be taking tests whenever they can. I take one before I travel to Edinburgh and before I travel back. They're really easy to take. They are free. So, I think absolutely if you have 30 minutes to spare, then take some tests. It doesn't cost you anything.
That's a good point that you make with regard to our island communities. I wonder from my own experience the move to regular testing of teachers and those in education in Scotland. I wonder if they could be used to evangelise and to spread that message as well. That, as you say, the lateral flow tests are free now and are available to everybody.
Yeah, and we're using them in the Parliament as well. So I think there's no reason that workplaces can't be providing them to their employees and making sure that wherever possible we're not spreading it unaware.
Thanks, Emma. Now then, Erin, it's being discussed in the press this week that the one of the implications of Scotland's relative success in dealing with the first and second waves has meant in turn that a smaller proportion of the Scottish population have antibodies, have resistance to the coronavirus, and as a result, that makes the response of the population to a potential third wave more difficult because there are fewer people in the population generally have resistance to the coronavirus. Do you think that do you feel that there's a risk of a problem with regard to a response to a third wave, or what's your view with regard to the messages that you're hearing and the way that, for example, the student population are being addressed with regard to the response to a possible third wave?
Well, as a PhD student, I've been working from home essentially through the entire pandemic. So I was not caught up in the sort of first and second wave issues that resulted in students being trapped in their accommodation or that resulted in high rates of infection in student accommodations. So I've fortunately been spared that. As for the lower rate of antibodies in the Scottish population, this isn't something I'm really an expert on, but we are doing a good job of rolling out vaccines. I'm very heartened to see that as of Monday, every health board in Scotland is going to have drop-in centres for vaccination for anyone over 18. So as for the students, I'm hoping we can get ahead of that with vaccinations.
That's a very good point. As we're coming towards the end of the academic term, so I'm thinking of the majority of the student cohort, not necessarily only PhD students, but as we come towards the end of the academic term, and of course this last academic year has been has seen students, as you say, either isolating or certainly not mixing in classes, or learning remotely, and a range of hybrid models being used. Do you think that it strikes me that the timing of the move to, as you say, drop-in vaccinations for anyone over the age of 18 in Scotland, that timing maybe doesn't sit particularly well with the undergraduate population who may very well be heading away from their universities any day now.
Yes, that is true. However, I think actually that helps that we've moved to a drop-in model, because one of the things that there is to criticize about our vaccine rollout was the way that we decided to rely on paper mail for people between 30 and 40. And again, that isn't really the undergraduate population, but at the same time, forcing people to make appointments either through their GPs or to be registered with a GP to get an appointment has actually been a problem for students. I know at least I know a handful of sort of undergraduate and master's students who have realized they weren't registered with a GP at all, which was making it difficult for them to even register by text for vaccinations. And moving to drop-in vaccinations does mean drop-in vaccinations in every region in Scotland does mean that as students go home, they can get their vaccinations at home without having to change GP registration or have difficulties with where their address is.
No, that's a very good point. You put in mind that the pressure on university-based medical services, who have, as you say, have a transient have a very mobile group of patients, and so the administrative burden for those university-based medical organisations will have been considerable. So the message, as you say, perhaps is for the student population: if you don't have the chance to get your first vaccination at the place of learning, please, the first thing you should do when you get home is go and get your jab.
Yes, absolutely. It's the only way we're going to get ahead of this.
No, that's grand. One other thing, Emma. We'll come back to this later on in the programme. We had Canada Day on Thursday. We have it's independent. It's the 4th of July, so it's Independence Day in the United States. I see that Professor Devi Sridhar was saying that she was saying that she doesn't like the idea of Freedom Day. She doesn't think that pandemics end with parades and flags. So in a week when there's lots of parades and flags, and at least in the English-speaking world. What's your view, Emma, with regard to the prospect of it? And I appreciate that the Scottish Government has not been ramping up the rhetoric on a Freedom Day in the same manner as perhaps Downing Street has been. Emma, what's your thinking with regard to the prospects for some kind of Freedom Day celebration and the pandemic not ending with parades and flags?
I would say, first off, I mean, imagine the outcry if the Scottish Government was promoting this Freedom Day in the same way that the UK government is. I don't think it would be a thing that we'd be cheered on for. But no, I think we have to be very aware of the fact that even when restrictions are lifted, that doesn't mean the virus is gone. We're already talking about booster vaccines for the most vulnerable this year, and I think that's something that we're going to probably have to consider for quite a while to come. So having a massive possible super spreader event to celebrate that cases have gone down is maybe a bit oxymoronic.
No, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And we'll stick with you and with Westminster politics as we move to the next story. But I think there's a connection here. During the week, Ian Blackford said in Westminster that there was a very real danger that the planned Westminster government cuts to universal credit, the rolling back of furlough and business support, which is beginning and will continue into the autumn. He was pointing out that there's a very real risk that will increase the rates of poverty and cause unemployment to rise both in the UK and across Scotland. We know from public health officials both in Scotland and England that there is a close correlation between rates of infection and relative poverty. We know that the most deprived areas in Scotland and in England are those which often suffer the highest rates of infection. So, Emma, what do you think the messaging is from Westminster in terms of, firstly, increasing financial pressure on people who may have had a very difficult year as it is, and at the same time the enthusiasm perhaps from Westminster for making those financial cuts? And at the same time, the likely implications on the rate of infections in Scotland.
Well, I think Ian Blackford is absolutely right, but this is not an issue which is specific to the pandemic. This Tory government always makes choices that increase poverty and the divide between the poor and the rich. So it's not a surprise to any of us that this is continuing even now. I think that we've seen throughout the whole time that policies have been made to protect big businesses rather than individuals. That's why, we had ministers coming out and saying, "Oh well, don't go to work if you don't have to." Well, people do have to, because that's how they get money, and that's how they have a roof over their heads and they have food. But there's that disconnect between thinking, "Oh well, you don't have to go into work today because you've got all that money in the bank," because they do.
Oh, absolutely. And as you would imagine, I think we certainly will continue to follow that line and that important story as it continues to develop over the summer and into the end and into the autumn here on Broadcasting Scotland. We will also continue looking at Westminster politics, and as Emma just said, it's a matter of choices. I think we're now seeing more attention being paid to certain choices that Matt Hancock made over the last few years in his political career, which, except as an MP, is currently on hold. And so, Erin, we've learned this week that there are questions are now being formally asked with regard to the manner in which Mr. Hancock's friend Gina Coladangelo obtained a parliamentary pass. Now, parliamentary passes for Westminster are handed out only in circumstances where you require to work at Westminster, and it's not at all clear what work it was that this lady was doing. What do you think, Erin? It is. What is the message that you take from the apparent way in which friends of ministers give or receive parliamentary passes, and then in due course become non-executive directors of the department where their friend is the minister?
I mean, this is an ongoing issue that we've had throughout the entire Tory government and longer, is that things that on the surface seem like sex scandals, that, people have their private lives and that is whatever it is. But the real story is things like, it doesn't matter really who people were engaged with. What matters is things like those relationships being used to obtain parliamentary passes or being used to obtain government contracts. And that is what we really should be focusing on and asking questions about, rather than sort of the salacious photos and videos of encounters.
No, that's a very good point, and of course, from a journalistic perspective, it's interesting that the headlines are often made by the red tops in a salacious manner, but that there are often more significant, both in political and constitutional and legal ways, underlying the kiss and tell or the headline grabbing pictures that appear. Do you think that what we've coming against the backdrop of significant complaints and legal findings in terms of the way in which COVID contracts are said to have been handed out to friends and family of Conservative ministers? Do you think, Erin, that this latest story with regard to Matt Hancock's friend, do you think it's just more of the same?
I mean, yes. When you remove sort of the salacious elements of the affair, this is just more of the same corruption that's been happening in this government throughout the entire pandemic. And I would hope when we have a change of government that there will be a full-scale inquiry into how the entirety of the COVID contracts and policy were handled.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Erin. Now, Emma, we know this week that another Tory minister's soon-to-be ex-wife has been writing in the press and saying that she wrote that climbing that far up Westminster's greasy pole changes a person, and when someone changes, they require something new from a partner. Now, whether or not you're a fan of Sarah Vine, she at least made the point that it was Westminster's greasy pole that she was talking about. But do you think the extent to which divorce lawyers in Westminster are now being run off their feet with a succession of challenges and problems, do you think, Emma, that says something about the culture in Westminster or the culture inside the Tory government?
Well, I mean, I would say first off, folk get divorces. It's 2021. It's not the 20th century, and politicians are allowed to have personal lives. If Gove and his wife want a divorce, then fair enough. But I think her comments are not something that it's not the first time I've heard this. And I think that Westminster politics, and in particular Tory Westminster politics, are exactly what put people off the whole system. It is jobs for the boys, it's cronyism, it's fine for them to break the laws that they make, and that's the real problem here.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Emma. We'll continue with UK politics, but we'll move to focus a little bit more on the Labour Party now. Following the success of their candidate Kim Leadbeater in the Batley and Spen by-election, she retained the seat for Labour with a much reduced majority of 323. But it was I think it's accepted that it was a particularly brutal and bruising by-election campaign on many sides, but the Labour Party managed to continue to hold on, and it's suggested that the Labour Party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is taking some comfort from the fact that the collapse that we saw in the Labour vote in the north of England at the last general election has not continued. But Emma, do you think that there are by-elections come and go, but do you think in the context of Batley and Spen that there are lessons for UK politics? What can you see in the runes of the result in that by-election?
I think, if I were a Labour supporter, I would be absolutely devastated that my party is just celebrating the fact that they're not losing any more than they already were, which was already too much. I think that the issue here is that regardless of what this Tory government decides to do and all the showing ups that they've had, England just keeps voting Tory. I don't think there's going to be much opposition here when I say that the Westminster system is broken, and it has been broken for a long time. I'm sat here in a country which hasn't voted for a Tory government for decades, and yet polling indicates that we're going to be stuck with one for probably at least another decade to come. And yet Labour are saying, well, we're not losing any worse. It's not good enough.
That's an interesting point that you make, Emma. In terms of the messaging from the Labour Party, as you say, the messaging in terms of the by-election is very much is that we've managed not to lose. I'm thinking then more widely about Labour Party messaging more generally, either in Scotland or on a UK basis. Are you picking up any positive stories from the Labour Party at all? Any positive messaging from the Labour Party at all at the moment?
UK-wide, no, not at all. I couldn't really tell you what Keir Starmer stands for, which is a real problem because I listen to what's going on in politics and I read the news, so I wonder how much cut through he has even with his own supporters.
Oh, absolutely right. And Erin, thinking about this story a little bit more, we've seen today and over the last couple of days the apparent rollout of Labour Party messaging round about a kind of buy British economic plan, suggesting that infrastructure projects such as there are should have a greater British component, and that there should be more focus on manufacturing buying British manufactured items. Does that, Erin, strike you as a message that either resonates with people or has any substance to it?
I mean, these sorts of quite simple messages about buying British do, I think, appeal to people, but they appeal to people in a populist way, which I'm not really sure is a positive move. I mean, we all roundly criticized, the US Buy American messaging, and I'm not sure that we're doing much better by insisting on a Buy British messaging. This is a different thing to insist on buy British for the sake of buying British than it is to focus on, for example, not buying things from oppressive regimes. That's not what they're saying. So.
Oh, that's a very good point. And reflecting a wee bit more generally, do you think, in political terms, are populist messages ever positive?
Not really. No, I don't believe in. I don't believe in the existence of a left populism. So no.
I thought that would be the case, but I just wanted to check. But Emma, do you think this How do you think this buy British messaging we've seen from the Labour Party over the last 48 hours, how do you think that's going to play in Scotland, Emma?
I don't think it's going to. Yeah, I think it's just really disappointing. It's clearly pandering to a Conservative base, which is not there because they're voting Conservative. So it's really just a sign of more things to come. I think Labour scrambling to win a voter base that they've already lost, rather than trying to build the one that's hunting for a home.
Yes, of course, and thinking of the status, that bringing the discussion closer to home, then thinking of the way in which the Labour Party has performed in the Scottish Parliament since the Parliament returned after the election in May. Do you see similarities or differences and distinction between the way in which the Labour Party is behaving on a UK basis and the way that the Labour Party is behaving in the Scottish Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be fair to Scottish Labour. They're not the same as UK Labour in the terms of their messaging. But if you are going to carry the torch of saying, well, we're not the Conservatives, that doesn't work in a parliament where we have a form of proportional representation. You have to sell something different. And I think the struggle that Scottish Labour has at the moment is that they're not doing that.
Yes, do you think, and it's not for you to advise the Labour Party in Scotland, but do you think there are areas in which they could begin to identify distinctive messaging and positive messaging if they're failing to do so from London?
Well, yeah, as you say, it's not for me to say what Scottish Labour should be doing, but when I look at where their support has gone, it's come to us because their support in Scotland is naturally pro-independence.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. We'll move on from looking at Westminster politics, both Tory and Labour, and we'll move on to another story now. We're aware that as well as Independence Days today and during the week, another important date in the past week was the deadline for EU citizens to apply for settled status in the United Kingdom as a result of the changes brought in following the vote for Brexit and the agreements that were reached eventually between Westminster and the EU. We know that the application backlog nearly doubled overnight on Wednesday, and we also know that there was a significant underestimation by Westminster of the number of EU citizens who would apply for settled status. I think at the time of Brexit it was estimated that there were around 3 million, and in fact it's now very clear that there are more than 5 million. And I was wondering, Erin, does that also indicate that the Westminster in the clamour for Brexit, that the Westminster government underestimated the importance and underestimated the roles that EU citizens play in our that they fulfil in our lives and our families and our communities in Scotland? And do you think that underestimation tells us something about the way in which Westminster views Europe and views Europeans?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously, you can probably tell from the accent, I'm an immigrant, but I'm from Canada, not from the EU. And I think that there is an underestimation of the role that immigrants play in this country in general. And I mean, there's two levels of this. When we talk about the role of immigrants in our country, we often do talk about our role in the economy, in the NHS, in the education sector, and about us as economic units. So I'm really glad that you mentioned our roles in our families and our communities, because when we talk about people either being forced to leave because of, potentially being forced to leave because of missing the settled status deadline, or having to leave because they feel like their connections to their home countries are being severed by Brexit or by the attitudes that Brexit has brought out, especially in England. We're not just losing economic units, which we obviously are. The service sector especially is really struggling right now, but we're also losing our friends and our families from this country. And not only have they underestimated the emotional and economic impact of that, but as you say, they've also underestimated the numbers. And when we talk about how the backlog increased towards the deadline, and about how the website went down for a while on the last day. There's also, when we have 5 million people needing to apply for the status, if even a fraction of a percentage of people who needed to apply for it didn't apply, which we're seeing is the case because it was complicated and confusing about who needed to apply and who already had some kind of legal status. We're talking about creating thousands and thousands of people who are falling out of legal status and becoming subject to the hostile environment. It's a travesty.
No, absolutely, and Emma, we'll think a little bit about the implications for communities and people and voters in your constituency in the Highlands and Islands. Over the last few months, what conversations have you been having with EU citizens who are having to apply for settled status, but who were making their lives and their livelihoods in our communities in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of confusion and a feeling that it wasn't fair that they were having to ask to stay, which I absolutely agreed with. But we are now seeing a lot of struggles between key sectors in the Highlands and Islands, like farming, where they're already struggling to recruit people. So it's unfair on a number of levels. But yeah, I think there was this really strong feeling of betrayal. I had one EU national saying to me that she never would have supported the SNP in the past because she was afraid that independence would mean that she wouldn't be able to stay. And now she was being told by the UK government that she had to apply to still live here, despite having lived here for years. So, yeah, I think confusion and betrayal.
That's an interesting point that you make, Emma. And I was reflecting that we know that in terms of the attempts to remove people living in Scotland who the Home Office assert have no right to remain or do not have settled status. Of course, we've seen the attempts by the Home Office in Glasgow receiving close attention from the people of Glasgow who were on the streets and were objecting and were preventing the removal of residents by the Home Office. Emma, do you think we'll see Home Office vans on the streets of Inverness attempting to do the same thing with EU citizens who have not been able to obtain settled status in Scotland?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be a new sight to see the Home Office in Inverness. So, yeah, I'm sure that we will. But I think the difference now is that previously people would see that and assume there was good reason for that van to be there. Whereas now I think there is an awareness that that's not necessarily the case. It might be something completely unfair and something that Inverness as a whole would completely oppose.
That's an interesting point that you make, the unfairness aspect. Do you think, in terms of the enthusiasm for the imposition of the immigration legislation by the current Home Secretary, and and that against the backdrop also of things we've already discussed on the programme around about the awarding of apparently lucrative COVID contracts to friends and families of Tory ministers? Do you think, Emma, that there's that sense of not being able to rely on or trust the actions of the Westminster government is going to begin to resonate and play on the minds of all people in Scotland, whether they're EU citizens or not?
Yeah, I think it will. I think it is. I think that's what we're seeing. People no longer look at the actions of the government and assume that there's goodwill behind it, because we're seeing a lot of the time that there isn't. It's just self-interest and policies which have been designed with a different country in mind.
Oh, absolutely. And Erin, turning to you, what have you been hearing from the organisations that you participate in, and also from the student community in Glasgow? What are the messages that you've been hearing, either about the events a few weeks ago, but also the implications that we'll see more of those kind of events as the success or otherwise of the application for settled status process, as that begins to play out? What have you been hearing from the student body in particular?
Well, I was actually briefly at Kenmure Street just towards the end of the day. And the feeling in the crowd there at the moment that the men in the van were released was of just elation and victory, and a sense that the Home Office can be fought and that we can win against them. Though I think it is important to remember that the same day that the city, the people of Glasgow prevented those men from being taken away, that someone else was unfortunately successfully taken by the Home Office from a shelter where there was not as much community presence to be able to notice and stop it. So I think we do need to bear in mind that while I think we are going to see increased resistance, both because of an increased sense of the injustice of the sort of deportations and detention, and because of the sense that we can actually win. There are people and demographics who are more vulnerable to being taken away without the community noticing. As for the student population, that is a different matter. I know the higher education sector is concerned in general with what is going to happen when the UK and Scotland particularly serve quite a high density of universities for the size of our country. Was a destination for people all over Europe looking to do their degrees in English. And there is a sense within the community that we are definitely going to lose that place as sort of the premier destination for study because of being able to do degrees in English to Ireland, essentially.
Of course, and Emma, that's an interesting point that Erin makes. Do you think that in terms of political activism and popular activism, Emma, do you think that this issue of the Home Office's enthusiasm for removing people from Scotland and from the UK, do you think the popular resistance to that, is that going to open up another area for activism and for popular political activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has. That's what we were seeing on Kenmure Street. There were hundreds of people there, just ready to help out, and I think that's probably the mistake that's been made, is that down in Westminster and Whitehall, people assume that EU nationals are them. You know, they're not part of us. And when you start removing folks, neighbours and friends and colleagues and bosses and nurses, folk aren't going to be happy about it. So they're absolutely going to jump to defence when you start to remove folk who are very much part of our community from our community.
That's a very interesting point that you make in terms of the Brexit messaging and populist messages, which we often messaging which in politics, which we often see are about the other or the othering of sections in our society, in our community, and attempting to blame or hand responsibility or to demonise or to pick on those groups as part of populist messaging. Do you think, is there a message there, or is there and the success of that approach in England and Wales, especially during the Brexit campaign and since? Do you think, Emma, that the response that was received in Kenmure Street and more broadly, do you think that shows that there is a widening difference in popular political beliefs and people's priorities between Scotland and England?
I think to a degree, yes, but it's probably more about the fact that this messaging, it's sad that it's effective, but it is effective because it is in the abstract. And as soon as you start dragging somebody out of their home on your street, then it's not abstract anymore.
That's a very good point, that apparently abstract political theories have implications for people and our communities and our societies. That's a very interesting point. And again, I suspect with the enthusiasm that the Home Secretary has shown for picking on immigrants and picking on people who picking on people. That we'll be covering that story a lot more as it evolves over the coming months, I'm afraid to say. What we'll do is we'll move now to more international news, and as I mentioned earlier, we've seen Canada Day this week, and it's Independence Day today in the United States. But Canada Day, in addition to being marked with the potential evidence of the impact of the climate crisis, and I'm thinking of the effects on the West Coast in particular. In addition, we saw protests on Canada Day with a statue of Queen Victoria and a statue of Queen Elizabeth pulled down in Winnipeg. Erin, as our resident Canadian expert today, I am, of course, going to come and ask you in particular. What's the headline message in your mind as a result of the events on Canada Day, and in particular the protests by Indigenous populations and representatives of Indigenous populations? What struck you most about the events?
To me, what struck me most about the events was the ability to actually organize the community and engage in the protests, like tearing down those statues. Obviously, the ongoing issues of Canada's treatment of Indigenous populations, which has essentially been genocidal, is one that has been our entire history. And while we have been in a public way attempting to address this, notably from 2008 with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the creation of things like the Missing Children Project. There has not been a real reckoning with Canada's ongoing treatment of Indigenous people. And basically, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report has been out for years. And for years, this information has been public knowledge that thousands and thousands of children died at thousands and thousands of Indigenous children died at residential schools, and that it's been public record that their graves were unmarked, that the death records often didn't note the name or gender of the children, making it impossible to find out, for parents to find out what happened to their children. And the government has hesitated and not provided funding for things like the ground penetrating radar technology that's being used to uncover the graves. And I think it's just that now, because basically funding their own investigations, First Nations have been able to bring to the public, like, here are the graves of these children that have been unmarked and unacknowledged, and it all coming to a head before Canada Day provided an opportunity for a very strong statement. And I think that it's no mistake that this or no coincidence that this happened in Winnipeg, which is home to Canada's largest urban Indigenous population and is the city with the highest Indigenous percentage of population. And also, Winnipeg does have a very radical history of protest that does actually have a monument to a time that in 1919 strikers, derailed a trolley car. So this is actually a pure expression of Winnipeg as a city, as well as of Canada's need to reckon with its colonial past and its continuing sort of colonial behavior towards the Indigenous population.
Thank you, Erin. But as I said, we're benefiting from your reflections and thoughts, in particular on matters in Canada. Emma, turning to a slightly Scottish perspective on this, or a more historical perspective, I think nobody would argue that it is not the case, if that's too many double negatives, that the role that Scottish settlers played in the exploration of North America and in Canada in particular, and as a result, their involvement in the maltreatment and the institutional maltreatment and the denigration of the Indigenous populations that those Scottish settlers met. Do you think Emma, what do you think the role that Scotland and Scots might play in the process that is now beginning to unfold in Canada, and which might also reflect on the role that Scots played in colonial activities, not only in North America, in other parts of the former British Empire? What lessons do you think there are for Scotland, or what do you think Scotland and Scots should be doing when reflecting on the events, for example, in Winnipeg this week?
I think first off, we need to be confident in not following the same route, the same attitude that Britain does in terms of not being ashamed enough of its colonial history. I mean, I see far more hints of that attitude continuing and even being celebrated, you know, having school kids sing about strong Britain, great nation, than I do hints that anybody wants to make reparations or be at all introspective and ashamed of what is a shameful history. I mean, I think I was most shocked that the UK government's initial response to all of this was to condemn any defacing of the Queen. And I think the first reaction of any empathetic, decent person would be to condemn the existence of unmarked graves of children. But of course, the Tory government is more concerned that somebody toppled a statue.
Yes, Emma, that's a good point. You're in Inverness at the moment, which means you're not far away from Golspie, where there's a notorious statue on top of a hill, on top of a Monroe. Do you think, thinking more broadly and thinking in more political terms, do you think the focus on statues, both by protesters and as you say, the Prime Minister's spokesman, the first thing he spoke about in this story was about the statue. Do you think the focus on statues is helpful in terms of activism and popular politics, or is it a distraction?
It's a hard one because I think the statues are definitely, you know, they're not just statues; they are monuments to an attitude, and part of tearing down that attitude has to be tearing down the physical existence of it as well. But you know, we talk about the Mani. I always had such a bad relationship with it because I found it all so bizarre. You start talking about, well, why do we still have him? Why haven't we taken him down? And some people are very, very defensive of the need to have it there, not to celebrate him, but to remind people of what he did. And I've always found that quite hard to reconcile. But yeah, I find the whole statues discourse very, very difficult to understand, to be honest.
No, of course. And then one last reflection on this particular story, and broadening the geographical aspect a little bit. As you say, the protests were, for example, were in respect of the discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked graves of children at a former residential school in British Columbia, and in Saskatchewan too. We know that similar discoveries have been made in Ireland. And indeed, in Scotland, for example, at Smilam Park in Lanarkshire, where it was apparent that hundreds of children had been buried either in mass graves or in unmarked graves and had not been given the respect or the proper treatment that they deserve. So thinking about, do you think there are lessons for Scotland or lessons for more broadly for us in terms of addressing and reconciling the way in which young people, children, and in particular if they were of an Indigenous population or of a particular faith, the way in which those children have been treated in the recent past, and what we need to do to address that and to reflect on that successfully in order that we continue to improve the rights of young people. Do you think there are lessons in any of this for us around the world, Erin?
Absolutely. I mean, throughout the world, basically any part of it touched by the British Empire and most of sort of what we would kind of call like the West, there is a logic of institutionalization throughout the second half of the 19th century, well, most of the 19th century, actually most of the 20th century, where we, as sort of broadly a culture, decided that any population that wasn't useful or didn't conform needed to be separated from their families and separated from the community and institutionalized. And if this meant children born out of wedlock, if this meant Indigenous children, if this meant children with intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities, this was a logic of institutionalization that we applied to young people broadly, and also to adults that we didn't deem sort of part of society. And I did actually, as a research assistant, work on the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, which touched a little bit on, which did touch on the way that we sort of isolated, institutionalized children. And that's something that's relevant to us, to Ireland, Canada, America, anywhere touched by the empire, that we need to have a serious reckoning with the entire logic of institutionalization, and also what that means for people who are under sort of state control in various ways now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erin. That's a very useful reflection. We'll move on a little bit with our penultimate story, which brings together and is focused really on the ongoing approach to the treatment of women in our society. In the past week, we've seen both the American actor Bill Cosby, who had been convicted of rape, despite it was said being one of the most powerful men in popular culture in the United States of America. We've seen his conviction overturned and his walking free from jail after 2 years as a result of what I would describe as particularly complex legal manoeuvrings. And at the same time this week, we've seen President Erdogan's determination in Turkey that he had declared back in March, but we've seen coming to fruition now his determination that Turkey would walk away from the Istanbul Convention. That convention is a Council of Europe treaty which addresses domestic violence and seeks to end legal impunity for perpetrators of domestic violence, particularly in respect of women. So, Emma, in terms of the having been speaking about the way in which we treat young people, what do you think the messages are from this combination of Bill Cosby's conviction being overturned and President Erdogan apparently stepping Turkey away from the Istanbul Convention? What do you think the messages are for people who campaign for women's rights in the EU and the UK in particular, Emma?
I think, first of all, the fact that he was convicted was probably more of a shock to those of us with experience dealing with these structures than it is that it's been overturned now. And seeing the protest videos in Turkey with folk being tear gassed, it really reminded me actually of England last year. Women protesting violence are often met with violence by police. It's horrendous that we're still seeing these images today from across the world, but to look at them and think it's really far away from us would be a mistake.
No, absolutely right. And Erin, from your perspective, do you think in terms of activism, what do you think what responses would you hope to see or expect to see from in politics when reacting to these two messages this week?
Well, in terms of activism, I would hope that people can continue to protest their government's unwillingness to engage seriously with the problem of violence against women. This isn't just a problem in Turkey. There are a number of countries where there is basically a organized campaign against the Istanbul Convention. There has been polling in countries that aren't very keen on it, where you'll see that there's been so much put into attacking the Istanbul Convention. When you poll people and ask them if they are against the Istanbul Convention, they'll say yes. But then if you ask them a different question about whether they are for basically all of the things that are in the Istanbul Convention, they'll say they support it. So I think work needs to be done on communications and combating sort of right-wing opposition to actually addressing violence against women. But this is part of sort of a larger problem that we actually have in terms of the messaging around various progressive measures. When you ask people, I mean, you can look at America, when you asked people if they like Obamacare, they would say no. If you asked people if they liked healthcare exchanges and being able to use their insurance for their dependent adult children, they would say yes. So I would hope to see us actually find a way to address the substance of what it is that we're trying to do in a way that can combat the sort of negative messaging that gets applied to any sort of progressive initiative. As for the Cosby situation, what's really disheartening about that is that while it is a complex legal maneuver that allowed his conviction to be overturned, and one that procedurally is technically correct, even though it is morally abhorrent. The problem is the reason that legal maneuvering was able to happen is because of years previously him being given a non-prosecution agreement if he agreed to testify in a civil trial, which essentially just led to a financial settlement with the victim. And it is because of his position of power and his position of wealth that he was able to be given a non-prosecution agreement and basically buy his way out of justice then, which is what led to the overturning of his conviction now. And I don't think it should be forgotten that one of his lawyers in this case was one of Trump's impeachment lawyers.
Yes, I don't think we certainly don't have time to discuss the whys and wherefores of the legal profession, because that'll take the rest of the day. But the point that you make is absolutely right. And Emma, do you think there are lessons here for Scotland, perhaps, in terms of either in terms of the ongoing campaigning for respect and proper respect for women's rights, or do you think that there is there messaging here in terms of the populist approach, populist messaging that we've touched on in the programme already? Apparently, the campaign, President Erdogan apparently attempting to other or to seek to blame 50% of the population by attacking women's rights.
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a really important demonstration that, you know, men in power who abuse their power are very difficult to convict and to achieve punishment for. It's really difficult to do that, and that's exactly the same story here. So we need to continue to press home that message if we're ever going to overcome it. I think we also can't separate this story from the fact that Turkey have withdrawn to appease homophobes. LGBTQ people are still persecuted worldwide, and we need to retain an awareness of that. Violent men over the world use homosexuality and transgender people to reinforce and protect their ability to harass, attack, and kill women with impunity. And we need to remain vigilant to that and remember who it is that is causing these issues.
Of course, thank you, Emma. That's a very good point, well made. Our final very brief story this afternoon on the Full Scottish ties back to discussions we've had this afternoon. Today is the 4th of July, and it is Independence Day in the United States of America. And I think I'll put the same question to both of our esteemed guests this afternoon. Firstly, Erin, do you think there are lessons in terms of the independence of nations such as the United States, any lessons that could be translated and learned in Scotland?
I think the United States is a possibly quite difficult comparison for us because, I mean, they won their independence in the 18th century in a war, which these are not really things that we are looking to replicate. And I actually, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with when we make comparisons between the independence of colonial states like the United States, or a very popular one to make since we're talking about Canada, a very popular one to make in Scotland is to compare us with Quebec. There is a difference, a significant difference in that they are still settler colonial states that have to reckon with what their independence meant for the Indigenous people. And that is a very different situation to what we are in now. So I would hesitate to make any direct comparisons with America, other than that what their example shows us is the same example that every country that became independent from Britain has shown us, which is that they've certainly never regretted it.
Of course, thank you, Erin. That's a good point, well made. And Emma, the same question to you. Do you think there are any lessons that Scotland can take from the celebration of independence in the United States today?
Yeah, I mean, first off, Erin is absolutely right. I think sometimes we are too quick to make inappropriate comparisons with other countries, and I'd sooner look at Ireland in terms of who we can learn from in leaving the UK. But what I would say is that the countries we've talked about today are celebrating their independence.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a perfect message to end our discussion on today. And I must say, thank you, deepest thanks to Erin Lux and to Emma Roddick for joining us on Sunday lunchtime and sharing with us their thoughts and reflections and ideas on the week's news today. So thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In making these programmes, such as the Full Scottish and Scotland at 7, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of those who are prepared to donate and to support the station financially. We are absolutely reliant on people's financial support, and so please, if you feel able to contribute, please support Broadcasting Scotland. You can see the web address for our supporters on the screen just now. So please go to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register if you're able to support us, because we rely on your support and we appreciate your support very much. We are also very keen to encourage people who would like to volunteer to assist the running of the station, either in front of the cameras or behind the cameras, or in promoting the station or assisting the station in any way. And so similarly, if you are interested in volunteering and participating in what we do here at Broadcasting Scotland, then please go to our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and if you'd like to volunteer, please send us a message and you'll be very welcome to join us. Meanwhile, that has been the Full Scottish for Sunday the 4th of July 2021. Thank you again to Emma and to Erin for joining us, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your weekend.